Hello and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival and today's program, ArtistRun Spaces. My name is Jenny Sigenthaler. I'm Program Director for Chicago Grants and Initiatives at the Terra Foundation for American Art. You can learn more about upcoming events at chicagohumanities.org and help to support the festival by donating or becoming a member. Thanks to our captioner for making this event more accessible. All digital events have closed captioning, which can be controlled through YouTube. You can learn more about accessible services at chicagohumanities.org/access. I would also like to thank Min Dai for her translation services for this program. The Terra Foundation for American Art is proud to be the sponsor of ArtistRun Spaces, which is presented in partnership with the Hyde Park Art Center. This week's festival programs are presented with the support of Southwest Airlines. Finally, I want to thank our presenters for coming together across geographies and languages to explore the vital role of artists in making spaces for creativity, which fosters community and has shaped the culture of Chicago and other cities. This creative community building is vitally important. Please help me welcome Allison Peters Quinn, Meg Duguid, and the Zhou Brothers.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's talk, ArtistRun Spaces. Thank you to the Chicago Humanities Festival, Allison Cuddy and Jagrave Davi, for partnering with the Hyde Park Art Center to host a conversation exploring the history of artist-run spaces in Chicago and the vital role they play in strengthening the ecology of the art and design community that helps define the city's cultural legacy nationally and internationally. I'm Allison Peters Quinn, Zooming from the Hyde Park Art Center, where I am the Director of Exhibition and Residency Programs. I will be leading today's conversation with some questions that aim to better understand the purpose and tradition of artist-led activity in Chicago over the course of about an hour. So let's see where the conversation takes us. In September, the Hyde Park Art Center came out with it came out of the pandemic lockdown to open an exhibition called ArtistRun Chicago 2.0. It's serving the steadfast network of 50 artist-led spaces and collectives around the city that have propelled production and presentation of significant new art over the past decade. Activating every gallery and public space within the building, the exhibition represents an extraordinary variety of models, missions, and methods, all dedicated to showing and supporting local artists today. In 2009, the Hyde Park Art Center presented the first ArtistRun Chicago exhibition, examining the artist-run landscape between 1998 and 2008. Today's exhibition picks up where that one left off while considering critical shifts in the field of art, including the rise of socially engaged practice, art professionalism, and the demand for more inclusive spaces. ArtistRun Chicago 2.0 closes Tuesday, November 2nd, so we are following all state guidelines for public spaces, including wearing masks, social distancing, and operating at a 25% capacity. So please register for your free tickets through hydeparkart.org. As a note, Hyde Park Art Center began as an artist-run space. It was created by artists in 1939 as the Fifth Ward Art Guild, and its first director was painter Harold Hayden, who stated, "Art should be found where people live and work," which I think is still the sentiment of many of these spaces, and the idea behind the Zhou Art Center, as well as the spaces that Meg has run. My interest in documenting and supporting artist-run spaces spans these past 20 years as the co-curator for both exhibitions, and I've been amazed by all of this creative energy Chicago continues to churn, grow, and constantly change the geography of the city with. I want to move to introduce some of the artists, or all of the artists that are in this conversation today. And I'll start with the Zhou Brothers. Both artists in this conversation have researched, witnessed, and been responsible in part for the artistic transformation of the city. The Zhou Brothers are joined by Min Dai, who will facilitate translation. The internationally acclaimed artists moved from China to Chicago in 1986 and started their own art center in 2004 by purchasing an 87,000 square foot building in the Bridgeport neighborhood to create an environment for the next generation of artists to grow together and a museum quality platform to show their work. This hub of activity hosts dozens of artist studios, art galleries that show local and international artists and create a unique public atmosphere for contemporary art. Their indelible impression on the city was acknowledged in 2014 when Governor Pat Quinn officially proclaimed October 16th, Zhou Brothers Day in Illinois. Happy Zhou Brothers Day. They're about to release a new children's book titled Flying Paintings, The Zhou Brothers, A Story of Revolution and Art, which tells their inspirational life story. We'll also hear from artist, educator, author, and curator, Meg Duguid. Hi, Meg. Meg is also releasing a book titled Where the Future Came From, a collective research project on the integral role of feminism in Chicago artist-run culture from the late 19th century to the present. The nearly 300-page book documents the 2018-19 so-titled exhibition and symposium at Columbia College, Chicago, where Meg is director of exhibitions for the college's 4 gallery spaces. This important historical exhibition unearthed feminist artist-run activities in Chicago from the late 19th century to the present and was funded by the Terra as part of its Art Design Chicago program. To acknowledge all of these connections involved in Artist-Run Spaces, Meg is also the founder of a little artist-run space, a tiny 25-inch space called Clutch Gallery, which is a mobile miniature white cube gallery located in a wooden purse that's traveled around the world on people's arms from 2009 to 2018 and has been revived for the exhibition Artist-Run Chicago 2.0. Check the Instagram account to see the current show. I believe it's Clutch Chicago Gallery. It is important to acknowledge that both brothers and Meg are active artists, constantly making work and showing their work in galleries and museums, while they are creating space for other artists to do the same. So let's jump into some of the questions. I think we'll start out with, to explore what is the history of artist-run spaces in Chicago? How early do we see them? Where do these start and for what purpose? I'm gonna start with Meg. And perhaps we could start with, because Maggie did a really great job of defining artist-run spaces in your publication. So maybe you could kind of place us in what is an artist-run space?
Well, an artist-run space, and for me, I think first and foremost, I define spaces as projects rather than spaces because spaces attach to a certain kind of capital that not everyone has. So I was really looking at artist-run projects specifically, and they are really things that are done for and by artists to amplify other artists as well as their own voices. This can take many forms, from like standard galleries and performance spaces to things in apartments to mobile art carts, mixtapes, purses, the insides of coats, medicine cabinets, and even now with the pandemic, more kind of virtual spaces. But really it's a way for artists to be in control of their own production and the way the work should be seen, often with the tools that they have close at hand.
How early do we see them? I think you explored that in your book very well.
So Where the Future Came From dates back to 1880 with the Palette Club, which was a group of women artists who came out of the Art Institute of Chicago. So the Art Institute of Chicago never had restricted admission, or officially restricted admission, because let's be honest, sexism and racism still existed. But this was a group of women who worked to draw together. Women were not allowed to be in classes with nude models. So this group of women were able to get into rooms to figure draw and sculpt and do things that they couldn't do with their male colleagues. I think Lynn Warren, who did the first kind of alternative space exhibition in 1984 at the MCA, also looking at kind of artist-run projects. She dated back to, I think, the 1870s with Vincennes Gallery, and I hope I have that name right. And so I think what you would find is, with a definition of artist-run spaces as open as it kind of needs to be, we could probably, if we had the history for it, go back to the beginning of time and discover artists are always self-producing and always putting things out there without necessarily the general structures of institution.
That's a great segue to also talk to the Zhou Brothers and ask them, why is it important for artists to create space for other artists to make and show their artwork?
When they first came in '86, they weren't really aware of the artist spaces at the time, but there were a lot of new galleries opening. And they met some friends from the Hyde Park Art Center, and it was and the Hyde Park Art Center was like an artist-run a center and a space. And Mr. Dahuang says that this idea sort of came naturally because they wanted to help out their artist friends from Europe and New York and from like all over the world to come to Chicago and have a free space to work on their arts. And so they created a foundation in 1991 to invite their friends to come and stay for 1 to 3 months to create art for free. And they think it's a nice way to support the artists, and they also realize that when they open these kind of spaces, it attracts a lot of commercial opportunities and businesses. So yeah, that was the main reason that how it started. They were saying that they built their studio in 2003, and it's 2 artist spaces. It's about 10,000 square inches, and majority of the reason was to have like international artists to come here and showcase their artwork, and sometimes they'll have special events. And the purpose of having the space is for artists to create their arts first and to make profits less. Yeah, that wasn't their primary consideration. Also, the reason why they created the space is that it's not just a space, it's also a center for that creates all sorts of possibilities for the artists to create their art freely as like they're living at home, and to make them feel at home, but at the same time to provide them an international platform for them to have bigger opportunities. And so the concept of the space is not just space; it's a center for art and for humanity. The reason for having this center is it's not just for artists to come in and do their own art. It's their wish to provide for the artists a permanent place to have bigger opportunities in the future. And also art and creation is everything, not profiting. So they're using their own platform and their own resources and their own power to bring in artists and creative energy from all parts of the world. And then so to create a sort of a power for the artists who come in and work in their center.
I think the Zhou Brothers raised some really good points about kind of the creative liberties that are taken in spaces that artists create for each other, because they know how important it is for that freedom and that risk-taking ability. I want to ask a little bit more detailed about Chicago in particular, and I'll give this question to Meg first. About what is it about Chicago's social, political, and economic history that makes it conducive to artist-run spaces here in Chicago in particular, Meg?
You know, I wish I knew the exact formula that made Chicago such a conducive place to be the kind of first or the trial run for things. I know in a lot of ways when I started cutting my teeth in independent spaces, which would have been in the like, kind of late 90s with like Dogmatic and Bodybuilder and I think the Butcher Shop. And in kind of like looking at how that was really a place to really experiment and kind of have room to like dig a hole in the basement of Dogmatic because it was a dirt room. Artists end up being in and around unique spaces. So I think they're often able to say, hey, this is a really unique space. Can you come in and do something here as a way to kind of create a community? But also I think that because Chicago and people have access to space here, they are able to have, let me rephrase that. Because people have access to space in Chicago, they're more able to kind of open up their spaces for artists to work kind of right where they are. But interestingly enough, something about Chicago makes it a testing ground for so many kinds of things. I just found out recently that the Silent Sentinels, the feminist women who picketed the White House and really pushed women's right to vote through this kind of silent picketing, tried it out in Chicago first. And then it moved to DC, and then it exploded and really kind of pushed the cause forward. And I think we see things like that over and over again in the artist spaces. How many Chicagoans have like kind of gone on and then opened a space in New York or LA that also kind of garners a certain amount of success?
Yeah. Perhaps the Zhou Brothers could also speak a little bit to why they wanted to create this center, this art center in Chicago rather than anywhere else.
They're saying that they sort of decided on this naturally because they came in 86, and the area they're at is Bridge Park, and they were, when they first came, they were the only artists here. And so, but now it became an art district and has hundreds of other artists. And also they started in Chicago because they came to America and they stayed in Chicago. It became their home, and it sort of just organically made them want to start it in Chicago. He did touch on that they also started wanting to have centers in Kansas City and in Beijing, and they've already started the construction of the buildings. So they reinformed on the ideology of them not wanting to just have the space here for themselves, but also to create opportunities and international platform for artists from elsewhere. And that's the main reason they started their foundation in 1991.
All right, we're going to move on to another question. So, you know, how do you think, Meg, and we'll start with you, Meg, how do you tell the history of these spaces, given the ephemeral nature of so many that lack official documentation, and a lot of it's word of mouth? I think your publication was really great in terms of like setting a ground, but you over and over in your work, you say, you know, this is just the beginning, this needs to be added to. And I feel the very same way about the ArtistRun Chicago series of shows. It was a way to document what was happening before that information disappears, so that those spaces who work so hard to make things happen don't have time to really archive. And I know you working with the Visualist also has been working on archiving spaces. So how do we archive these spaces? How do we tell that story?
No, what a great question. That story is so difficult to tell because, I mean, even in my full-time job, right? I put shows up for Columbia College, and you know, once we're done getting the show up, I may or may not have the final catalog text like saved directly into my file. So like 2 years later, if I'm like looking for that final catalog text, rather than like the last edits in design, I might not be able to find it because it really doesn't exist. And that is something that I get paid to do, right? And I think many arts administrators know that their files are incomplete because as humans, we are messy. So then when you kind of add the layers of being in the artist run, it compounds that mess. Often people who are running these spaces are not arts administrators, which, by the way, is a word that's really only like, what, 30 years old? So, you know, in 1890 especially, there were no arts administrators. And they are just getting work up. And they may or may not keep every show card that they did, if you even do show cards anymore. One of my favorite things is the lack of dates on old flyers. You're like, this happened on August 27th, and you're not sure what year.
Nope.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And, you know, now I feel like in some ways, because of the web, we almost are able to gather more information, because really a description on like the Visualist can be like this long with every artist's name, every curator listed, whereas like a small mention in a newspaper was what, like maybe 1 column inch. So it would just have the dates of the show and the opening, and you weren't really sure who was involved or how long it lasted, because of just money, right? The money that it would take to print all of that for every gallery. So the histories are wildly messy and wildly inconsistent and wildly incomplete. They often favor white spaces and spaces that have had artists that have gone on and have some kind of institutional acclaim. We have, I think, as a community, yet to do the work that required to really kind of look at our like kind of local and community newspapers to really dig up what those were capturing. The Reader in the 90s was really where you found everything. It was like this thick for anyone who's you know, 30 and under. It was like this thick, and you would go in and you would read that's where you would find all your alternative spaces to kind of go and look at things. The Reader only got delivered to Roosevelt, right? It did not get delivered south of Roosevelt for many, many, many years. So therefore, what the Reader covered did not necessarily include the South and the West sides. So just by dint of that, there's a lot being left out. And where the future came from, and really the work that we're doing at the Visualist, we're trying to collect small artist-run projects that are kind of happening everywhere, because women and people of color have been around since the beginning of time, and they've done stuff too. And interestingly enough, I guess while you were asking that question, it occurred to me that the archiving efforts being done right now and have been done in the last 30 years are all by women, with Lynn Warren and you and me and Tempest Hazel at 60 Inches from Center. That is really kind of interesting, because I think right now we're at a time when we're really watching women disappear again, a lot because of COVID and relationships to childcare and family care, and this idea that histories could kind of get unwritten. And of course, with women kind of banding together to create space for kind of making their own work, it's just kind of an interesting moment where we're looking at like women trying to make sure that this work isn't unseen, while potentially kind of going back under, being a little more unseen. And I guess, you know, just as a note, you know, women's submissions to journals have gone down by 40% since the beginning of the pandemic. So you can imagine that that is going to reverberate through every cultural institution, kind of everywhere. Wow. Not to digress, but.
that's something to think about. I want to phrase this question for the brothers to think about them telling their own story. Their website is really, I think, a kind of a playground of information for us to really dive into, but more particularly about them releasing the memoir in the form of a children's book. And I want to definitely mention the author, Amy Alzauner. I don't know if I said her last name correctly, but that's a very particular way to tell your story. Why did you choose this format to document your experience and explain your origin?
Funny, it's also a coincidence because the author Amy participated in their center's events, and she was deeply influenced by the atmosphere, the artistry atmosphere in their center, and so she went back and created a book on her own, and she showed it to the Zhou brothers, and they were very moved by it. And so after they've negotiated with the publishers, they were looking for artists to create the arts in the book. And the Zhou brothers decided to do it on their own, to draw their own story out. That's basically how they've come across to have this children's book.
Yeah, it's a very great way to kind of tell at the base of kind of creativity where everything comes from, and where the ideas for even making an artist-run space can come from. Can I go to the next question?
Yes.
And maybe we'll kind of wrap it with this question to think a little bit about the future, and how does Chicago incubate more of these spaces that inspire artists to take more risks in creating new models for art making and public engagement? I know both of you have been very involved in creating spaces that younger artists look to as models, as guides to think through what they can do. So what do you think the future is?
They think by having the experiences of creating the center in Chicago and creating the spaces for young artists to sort of to have the power and encouragement and the spirit to create more art. They feel like they've it's a successful example of creating a influence of different culture and art and made it into prosperity. And because of that, Kansas City has reached out to them and wanted them to create another art center in Kansas. And they feel like by having these artist spaces, they're different from other kinds of spaces because they create a sense of community and a sense of a spirit to encourage young artists to have a bigger platform.
Meg, what do you think?
So I think in some ways the future and the past are synonymous. The future is an anti-institutional future. I think that artist spaces are often pushing against institutions. And right now in this country, as we are watching our institutions be wholly inept at caring for our own humanity, we are watching artists, and we have been watching artists step in over the last few years. I'm thinking about F4F, which is a space that was in Little Village and run by Joy Drew and Amina Ross and some others. That it was really a space for self-care for kind of Black and queer communities. And what taking that space means And I think we're watching a sea change right now where people are taking their own space and reclaiming their own humanity. And that has kind of directly come out of those sorts of spaces. Or Nicole Mariquin's work, she's an artist who has been working on revising the way we see history in Little Village, specifically in like the 1960s and 70s school walkouts, and what really students were saying and fighting for at that time, and then mapping that on to today, working with current students, like current high school students, and understanding what that means and what our histories are. To kind of reference 60 Inches from Center and Tempest Hazel, now also someone who's been looking at past histories and who's been left out, and also looking at current culture makers and who's been trying to kind of put those people back into the conversation. So I think the future is absolutely related to understanding the past better in a way that doesn't exclude or whitewash, and pushing towards a moment where like artists and culture makers are free to create their work as well as care for their own humanities. And the ArtistRun, I think, is always a nexus of that and always a reflection of what's going on in the time.
Yeah, and I also think in what you all are doing and what we've done with Lumpen Magazine to document this moment of ArtistRun Spaces, to keep producing those documents, whether it's on the web or in a book form, so that that story doesn't get lost and we can continue to build on that story. And keep dreaming these spaces that, like you say, like need to really think through how these crumbling institutions are going to kind of serve civilization.
Yeah, and I guess, just to add one more thing, the point of these documents, the point of like where the future came from, is not that it's a perfect compendium, but that is it. Oh, thank you, Allison. It's not that it's a perfect compendium, but instead it's a start, and that in 20 years, that research will be picked up by not one other person, but like 5 other people. And then the information and where the future came from will look embarrassingly small. And it should, right? If we do it right, the information in that book should look small and sometimes maybe a little messy, because it is a start and a ball to be kind of picked up and passed along.
I think I'm going to offer the moment to have any last words. Thank you for that, Meg. Do the Zhou Brothers have any last words to say to close this conversation? I think we're almost out of time.
谢谢这个机会啊，就是谢谢。
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. It was really great to speak with all of you.